You're listening to Doing Time, Talking Crime, a podcast that showcases the research currently being conducted at the Max Planck Institute for the Study of Crime, Security and Law in Freiburg, Germany. My name is Christopher Murphy, and I'll be sitting down with researchers to talk about their projects, the various methods they use, and how their findings have impacted legal, criminological and psychological research in Germany and abroad. All this and more on Doing Time, Talking Crime. Okay, well, thank you very much for tuning in to another episode of Doing Time, Talking Crime. On today's episode, we're going to be discussing the relationship between short-term mindsets and crime. We'll also assess how adverse environments and police contact may increase short-term mindsets and thus contribute to future delinquency. To do so, I'm joined in the studio by Jessica Deitzer. Jess is a postdoc at the Institute's Department of Criminology, where she is working in the project Crime Time, which looks at the nexus between short-term mindsets and crime. Jess, welcome to the program.
Thank you, Chris. I'm so excited to be here today.
Wonderful. Excellent. Well, let's maybe begin by you giving us a rundown of exactly what short-term mindsets are and equally what long-term mindsets are.
Sure. So short-term mindsets, we call it as an umbrella term. Mm-hmm. And what I mean by umbrella term is that it's a larger term encompassing several different other terms that all kind of coalesce around a tendency to focus on the present while disregarding or discounting the future. So this can include many different constructs, including impulsivity, which I think most people are familiar with, which would be an inability to resist immediate temptations or not thinking about the future when you act. Sensation seeking, which would be a preference for exciting and thrilling experiences in the present moment. And the lack of future orientation, which future orientation would be the tendency to make plans or goals for the future and to act in accordance with them. So long-term mindsets we're less focused on directly, but it could be considered kind of the inverse of short-term mindsets, where you would be focusing on and valuing the future over the present.
Okay, right. So the short-term, I'm living the now, and long-term, I'm worried about my 401k.
You're thinking about the future. Yes, exactly.
Okay, right, okay. And then, well, how then are these, particularly short-term mindsets linked then to crime?
Yeah, so of course there are some crimes that might be associated with or even require thinking about the future, some long-term planning, like maybe fraud, white-collar crime, organized crime. But that is not the norm. Most crime can be kind of impulsive, off the cuff, and people who prioritize the present at the expense of considering the future while making decisions, like i.e. those who have a short-term mindset, they tend to overall have worse life outcomes, including engaging in more crime. So this makes sense because a focus on the short term can make criminal behavior more appealing. If you think about crime, a lot of times it tends to offer immediate rewards, whether that be money or property, social status from your peers, thrill of the moment, the satisfaction at getting back at somebody who wrongs you. Mm-hmm. And it can offer these immediate rewards despite the potential for long-term costs. Crime is illegal. There's always some kind of costs or risks that can be associated with it. So this can explain why short-term thinking, prioritizing the present over the future, can be one of the most consistent predictors of crime and delinquency. And this is also true in adolescence, where adolescents can be a little bit more impulsive and they can be a little bit more focused on the present as opposed to their long-term prospects. Yeah.
Sure, yeah. Mm-hmm. When we're talking about these kind of short-term and long-term mindsets as such, it kind of reminds me, I remember reading about the marshmallow experiment on delayed gratification. And based upon that, it would seem to suggest that these kind of mindsets are somewhat innate, or that we're maybe born with these mindsets, and that some children would go for the marshmallows now and some would wait patiently for the marshmallows later. Could you maybe tell us a little bit about this experiment and the way that you see the results?
Right, yeah. And I think the marshmallow test is one of the most popular forms of this that we see come up. But it does also remind me of, in criminology, the theory that's most linked to short-term mindsets is self-control theory. And it's the idea that kids relatively young they develop this sense of self-control. And that's through things like parenting. And then after this age, it's supposed to be relatively stable. You're kind of set with this level of self-control throughout your life. And the marshmallow experiment kind of seemed to back that up at first. The idea with the marshmallow experiment is, you put a marshmallow in front of the child, you tell them that they can have a second one as long as they can wait a certain amount of time, see if they can go 5, 10, 15 minutes without eating the first one, and whether or not the child is patient enough to wait and delay gratification, wait for the second marshmallow, is supposed to be indicative of a sense of like willpower that will lead to later term success.
Sure.
So they found with the initial experiment, which happened in the 70s, they followed these kids for a while and they found connections with, SAT scores, other forms of academic and work achievement, even weight, antisocial behavior, or on the other side, like good social behavior.
I didn't know that at all. I thought it was just an experiment in the moment, but they actually did follow up and kind of this cohort of marshmallow eaters were then followed.
They did, yes. They did. But more recent research has kind of questioned this. For example, that was, one small sample of kids that were mostly the children of staff and faculty of a university. So it could be a specific group. It was a small group. So they've looked at more research about this with more diverse groups of preschoolers. And once they controlled for differences such as household income, cognitive abilities, parenting, they found only weak relationships to some of these later things like academic outcomes, and no correlations with some things like antisocial tendencies. So a lot of this new research essentially suggests that the capacity to hold out for a second marshmallow depends a lot on a child's social and economic background.
Right. So not so much born with a certain willpower. Some obviously yes, but others there isn't an influence then from the outside environment.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So the outside environment would be linked with both the ability to wait for the second marshmallow and these later life outcomes. And so the ability to wait wouldn't necessarily be super important. A lot of the effects might disappear. And it does make sense because, your social and your environmental background can change whether you think there will be the opportunity for more marshmallows later, if you think about it that way. Or if you know that there will be more marshmallows later,
sure,
it seems less dire to like indulge yourself right at this present moment. It's easier to wait.
Okay, so they might be that they wouldn't believe the person's going to give them 2 marshmallows at all, and then like, oh no, because of my environment, social environment, I'm going to get this 1 marshmallow in now. Either my prospects are not so great, so I'm going to indulge myself when I see the opportunity, or do I really believe that there's going to be a long-term payoff to delaying gratification if I wait for this marshmallow? And there's even an experiment that manipulates amongst 3 to 5-year-old children. It manipulates whether the experimenter shows themselves to be reliable or not with a prior task, whether they follow through on a promise. Okay.
And those kids are already at that age influenced by the reliability of the experimenter in making the decision whether or not to wait. So if in the unreliable condition, the children waited shorter in a subsequent task when they had to delay gratification, they waited less. So this essentially suggests that you might decide not to delay gratification in kind of response to, poor or uncertain, unreliable future prospects or people. So your environment can influence.
Definitely does influence. Wow.
Yeah.
I had no idea that there was such a school of marshmallow studies. I thought it was the one study that had ever been done, but wow, okay.
There's plenty, especially with the current, drive in psychology to replicate. And there's been a lot of work in this area.
Okay, rightio. Well, that's then, that's a good segue to the marshmallows and talking about, from the marshmallows to your study, and environmental factors. So you've looked at this issue from a number of angles, and one of the angles you've taken is the role that harsh and unpredictable environments play in short-term mindsets. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Sure, yes. And I think we do build on these sorts of ideas from these like replications in the marshmallow experiments using different kinds of data that follows kids or adolescents over time, starting when they're pretty young, maybe 5, 7, 11, and following up with them every year or two until they graduate from school or even later. So we kind of extend this line of research by looking at what factors in an adolescent's life can possibly encourage such mindsets, arguing essentially that a focus on the present can occur in response to lots of different environmental factors, many different personal experiences. And our first research project narrows in on one of these, which is exposure to harsh and unpredictable environments that you mentioned, and how that might change how adolescents think. Harsh environments are those where there are insufficient resources or violence in the environment, and that can signal that there's an enhanced risk of death, injury, or other undesirable future outcomes that kind of bring the utility of thinking about the future into question.
And these are, so when we say environment, this is the social environment or the home environment in which one grows up.
Yeah. Specifically in this study, we look at harsh parenting, corporal punishment, victimization, violent friends, or violence in the family when it comes to harsh environments.
Okay.
And unpredictable environments are what it sounds like, environments that can be characterized by frequent changes, chaos, instability. So we look at things like having low socioeconomic status, instability within the family, a lot of moves, divorces, switching schools, things like that, low involvement by the parents or low attachment to the parents, and inconsistent parenting and how they discipline and treat the kids.
Okay, right. Understood, yeah. Okay, and your data, where are you getting it from?
The data that we use for this project comes from two places. It comes from one collected in the U.S. and one collected in Switzerland. So, yeah, we wanted to test in two different places to look at whether seeing these sorts of environments in both places, whether that's linked to short-term thinking and to then later delinquency through that. So the overall idea is that youth growing up in these environments that are harsh and unpredictable, they might see the world and other people as undependable or uncontrollable. They might see their future as likely to be as harsh and unpredictable as the present. And without confidence that their future goals will come to fruition, it makes little sense to delay gratification.
Okay.
So they may then opt to just focus on the present rather than focusing on a future that, that is not necessarily stable or guaranteed.
So that's where the short-term or the disposition then to a short-term mindset comes in.
Exactly, yes.
Okay.
Yeah. And this is not an entirely new idea in criminology either. So there's a lot of qualitative research that highlights a kind of live for today attitude amongst offenders, where they think tomorrow is not necessarily guaranteed in their current environment and lifestyles, that they might have negative fatalistic views of the future, or they might think they don't have a future. They might think that they are especially likely to have an early death. And that's linked to continued offending, this perception of, futurelessness or having a bad or poor future.
Right. I wonder if the Romans were particularly worried about their future with their carpe diem phrase.
Seize the day.
Seize the day. Maybe they had short and miserable lives. I'm not too sure.
Perhaps, you see messages telling you to focus on the present a lot.
That's right.
Even in popular culture today.
You said you found this, that there definitely is a link then between a harsh environment and a disposition to short-term mindsets and hence crime. You're looking at the USA and Switzerland. Now, I did a little bit of research beforehand, and I found out that Switzerland fits into the US 238 times, and Switzerland has a population of 8.5 million, and the US has a population of 328 million, roughly. So very, very different data kind of sources there. Did this show up in your findings at all, the difference between these two countries?
Yeah, great question. So first of all, a little overview of our findings. We do indeed find evidence, like you said, that harsh and unpredictable environments are associated with short-term mindsets, and that this partially explains the relationship between harsh and unpredictable environments and delinquency. And this was true of several of the variables we looked at, including having inconsistent, uninvolved, or harsh parents, being victimized by one's peers, and having violent friends. Those were some of the things that were most consistently associated with short-term mindsets, which partially or fully explained their relationships with delinquency. And the short-term mindset that was the most important was sensation-seeking.
Okay.
That was true in both countries, actually, sensation-seeking. And this makes sense because adolescence is a time where, present thrilling and fun experiences kind of reign supreme. So we did, like you mentioned, look at both the USA and Switzerland. And they are obviously very, very different countries, like you mentioned. And this design was partially on purpose because testing similar hypotheses in very different samples can tell you something about how generalizable the results and the findings are. Do we observe this just in specific environments, or do we observe this in many different environments? And, we don't have a sample of the entire world, unfortunately.
No.
But it can help us to be a little bit more certain about
It's a long-term goal.
Yeah. Much, much more long-term than the scope of this project. Yeah, and so while both are, relatively affluent countries, there's a lot of differences. Switzerland can be a bit of an outlier in that regard.
Yeah, certainly.
And within our data, even there was big differences because one sample uses the public school students of Zurich, which is the biggest city in Switzerland.
Yep.
And the other data looks at rural and semi-rural communities in Pennsylvania and Iowa in the U.S.
Also a difference, even within the two countries, a very different setup then.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
So the places where we do observe differences, we can't tell you with certainty why those are. Okay. If it's the kind of people, if it's the kind of places, the kind of communities, the countries, we can't be sure about the differences. And we did see a lot of similarities that I had mentioned, but there were also some differences. So socioeconomic status, family instability, and harsh parenting, they only held effects, whether direct or indirect, on delinquency in the U.S. data.
Okay.
And it could be that for socioeconomic status and family instability, those things might have only gotten to enough of a level to be impactful in the U.S. data compared to Switzerland, which is quite affluent.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
So that could be why. As well, we see that corporal punishment was more impactful on short-term mindsets in Switzerland, while harsh parenting was more impactful on short-term mindsets in the U.S., which could be nothing, but it could also be something there.
Room for future study, so to say, to realize why maybe that is.
Of course.
Yeah, okay. Yeah,
especially when we get the sample of the entire adolescent population of the world. Like
absolutely, that's right. Yeah. Exactly. You've always got to have long-term goals, You're listening to Doing Time, Talking Crime, a podcast by the Max Planck Institute for the Study of Crime, Security and Law. Is it then a good time to talk about, because you've also had a second project that's taken a somewhat different approach, not so much the harsh environments and the effect that they have on short-term mindsets, but rather interactions with the police and the future outlooks of adolescents. How did you go about this one, and what did you find out?
Sure. For this one, we do use the data from Zurich again.
Yeah.
So that part is similar, but we
just Zurich, sorry?
Just from Zurich,
okay.
For this project. But we ask a very different question. Whereas in the last one, we were interested in adolescents' larger social and family environments. Here, we're focused on a specific experience that they might have that might lead to more short-term mindsets, and that's contact with the police. So we see that amongst adolescents, arrest or other contacts with the police can increase offending rather than acting as a deterrent sometimes. So we argue that part of this reason might be because contact with the police can lead adolescents to expect additional police contact or criminal justice system problems in their lives. It can also lead to spillover effects into other areas of their lives, for example, social, academic, especially if people learn about this sort of police contact and if they're then stigmatized or anything like that. With all the things that might follow from a police contact, their perceptions of the future might begin to dim. And individuals who do not see themselves as having particularly positive futures, they often devalue their future then. which is where short-term mindsets come into play. They might then decide to, focus on the present, not their long-term future goals, and engage in more criminal behavior as a result.
What kind of police contact does that then require, though? I mean, or the severity of the contact, so to say, warning, fines, arrest? Is this important, the severity, or is basically any contact with the police a contributing factor?
That's a great question, and it's likely that the severity of the police contact is really important, especially when you're talking about experiencing outside stigma and things that will limit the future. We would expect to see more of that if you have more serious contact with the police that you think is going to lead to later issues and later spillover effects into other areas of your life. In this study, as police contact is quite rare, we didn't have enough data and sample size to look at these differences between getting a warning, a fine, arrest, later follow up with social service or other outcomes that could happen after police contact. So we just look at police contact overall for a behavior that the adolescent was doing that was against the law.
Okay.
So that's the criteria that we have here. And with the same data from Switzerland adolescents, we do see that first-time police contact is associated with an increase in short-term mindsets, especially for younger adolescents. So we don't see that police contact overall just on its own is enough, but when it's the first time they've had this contact, and especially when they're younger and experiences are probably more impactful, we do see a difference. And this makes sense because police contacts that occur earlier in life could easily be most impactful on how you look at your future. And I think that's why it's an important question to ask, looking at early first-time experiences with the police.
Right. Obviously, I guess when we say experience as well, not just, probably not even a warning if it's done in a harsh kind of way, could also have a negative experience. So it doesn't actually have to be an arrest, maybe done correctly and fairly. Maybe one would think, okay, my bad. Whereas for something where you feel, I didn't really do much, but the way you're told off by the police could be overboard or something like that, then that could also lead to, I guess, a very negative response.
Right. And there you're getting into something that does have a name in criminology, which is procedural justice or police legitimacy, which is not just about having the police contact, but about how that police contact went.
Look at that. Wow.
Yeah.
Smarter than I thought. Okay. Well, that's something I wanted to ask because Zurich, again, we keep harping on about how affluent Zurich is. I'm probably going to get an email from someone saying we're not actually that rich, but not all of us. But obviously, I'm thinking like in America, for instance, sometimes, see something on the news or whatnot where there's just people carrying more guns, right?
Of course.
And I mean, as a police officer, you just way more on edge, and like any contact you're going to have with the police in the States is going to be different to what it is in Zurich, simply because of this concern you might be being shot, basically. And I understand that from the police perspective. How confident then are you, what you found in Zurich, being an affluent, probably not so much gun-toting city, could then what you found there is valid for other locations?
Yeah, and that was, again, a little bit part of the consideration of the study and its design, was this specific sample in Zurich, because there is actually prior research that has looked at this with American samples. They've looked at whether police contact decreases self-control, future orientation, things that are part of short-term mindsets. And these samples that are mostly American also are mostly adversity exposed, or sometimes referred to as at-risk youth. So youth that live in neighborhoods or have otherwise been exposed to risk factors that put them at a higher risk of short-term mindsets and delinquency.
Back to your harsh and unpredictable environments, kind of.
Exactly. Yeah. So, and it's also been in some cases youth who are already serious offenders and already caught up in the criminal justice system, and then they look at whether police contact still leads to a decrease in self-control or future orientation. And they find that it does, but I think it's also interesting to look at, what about youth in general? What about youth that aren't specifically at risk? What about youth that live in the affluent city of Zurich yet again?
Okay, sure.
Which has a pretty progressive police contact as well, compared to America, especially when it comes to adolescents. And from what we can see from comparing our results to other studies, police contact has less of an effect in our Zurich sample. So I think this is an interesting finding. The magnitude of the effect on short-term mindsets is larger in the other samples, the U.S. adversely exposed or delinquent samples. And the overall effect of police contact on decreased self-control, future orientation is a statistically significant finding in the U.S. samples. While for us, we only see that first-time police contact, and especially for younger adolescents, seems to lead to a decrease in your future orientation and an increase in your sensation seeking. So that suggests then that it's only specific types of police contacts that are having that kind of effect in Zurich, while it might be police contacts overall in the U.S.
In the U.S., okay.
Yeah. Yeah, but we, of course, can't discern whether the differences in our results are, again, because of people or place. And by this, I mean, different group of people, Americans, usually in a city, usually exposed to adversity, versus a different type of place, which is a different country and the whole different policing context that comes with being in a different country.
Sure. Okay.
Yeah, so I think it would be interesting to see if the effects in these U.S. samples also grow larger when you consider, first-time and younger adolescents being exposed to police contact. And I think it would be also interesting to look at more samples in other countries as well.
Back to our worldwide
data.
That's right. So this is something that one could do with enough resources, though, that you could different countries, different subsets could be analysed.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
We haven't really talked much about deterrence theory yet, or we've talked more about, more the opposite, rather than people would be thinking that a run-in with the police would be more likely to result in possible short-term mindsets and future delinquency, whereas deterrence theory would tend to say the opposite. And I can only speak from my own experience, but I remember driving around definitely over the limit in Australia, speeding, not over the drink driving limit, sorry, over the speed limit, and I got busted by a police officer, had a fairly hefty fine, and it certainly didn't really improve my view of the police, but it did stop me from speeding. And I haven't been caught speeding since, and so in my case, I'd say the deterrent effect was pretty successful. So why doesn't deterrence work after all?
I would say I've had similar experiences as well, being pulled over for speeding and still sometimes manage to go 5 to 10 over the limit. So, in that way, it hasn't had a clear deterrent effect on my behavior.
The fine wasn't hefty enough. That's the problem.
Well, don't get me into certainty versus severity effects. That's a whole other conversation. But yeah, in my case, it may not have had as big of a deterrent effect, although I might not speed as much. I don't want to imply that police contact doesn't have a deterrent effect, however.
Because, the whole justice system is built around this concept of deterrence, right?
Right. Yeah. Which is a big conversation. And we do know that contact with the police can increase your risk perceptions, which means the likelihood you think that you're going to get caught in the future. So that's a well-known finding. So I don't want to imply that that's not true because we've observed that, but rather that this study can help explain why two things can be true at the same time, which is that your risk perceptions rise after having this sort of contact, which can lead to a change in your behavior, and that police contact and arrest can sometimes be associated with increasing crime, especially amongst young adolescents. So how do we kind of reconcile these two things? And we suggest that both can be true when you consider the role of short-term mindsets as well. If after police contacts, your perceptions of the risks of having further police contacts rises, but you also devalue later risks because you're more focused on the present rewards rather than the later risks, you might still see a rise in offending behavior, even if it does still have that effect of increasing the chance that you think you're going to get caught.
Oh, okay. Right.
So also your response to police contacts and arrests can depend on many things. Deterrence works for many people, but not all people. There tends to be a group who would never offend no matter what. Okay. So for them, it's not important whether or not they have this contact with the police. They're not speeding because they don't want to speed and they don't think it's right to speed.
Because against the law, so they are law-abiding citizens.
A law-abiding citizen,
okay.
exactly.
Yeah.
And then there's a group of people who won't change their behavior. The police won't matter to them because they see themselves as a speedy driver, and that's how they want to drive, and they're going to drive like that regardless.
Okay. They live with the risk of being fined, so to say.
Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah.
They're aware of it, and they're like, okay.
Exactly.
Okay.
There's always a group of those people, and even in some subcultures, having contact with the police for something that is a common behavior that might be part of your identity.
Yeah.
It can even be seen as perhaps a badge of honor.
Oh, okay. Yep.
But it's the group in the middle, the deterrables, so to speak, who change their decisions based on their perceptions of risk and based on how they consider the present versus the future, etc. And that's the group that we're most interested in. And we see here that if there's an increase in risk perceptions, but there's also an increase in short-term mindsets, that can help explain some of the countervailing findings around deterrence.
Okay, right. But that leaves us in a sticky position, or at least the policymakers. We thankfully don't, or I don't have to make these decisions. On one hand, we have the fact that deterrence sometimes works, whereas sometimes it will backfire. Likewise, harsh environments, the findings there are that sometimes they would definitely lead to an increase in delinquency, where in other situations they won't. Where does that then leave policymakers, and what should they do?
Right.
I know that's a big question.
That's a big question. And as researchers, we always want to realize our studies have limitations and there's more research to be done. But I do think that there's some things that our line of research can suggest may be helpful.
Yeah. Fire away. This is the platform. Everyone's listening in.
So ideally, I think policy responses should help adolescents avoid the adverse experiences and environments in these sorts of studies, which, there aren't really any bad consequences to helping an adolescent avoid harsh and unpredictable environments, for instance, right? So that would be ideal. Early intervention in parenting and other aspects of adolescents' environments, that's the type of programs and policies that we see making a really big difference in adolescents' lives. So I think that would be, first and foremost what we would hope to do, but that's a very big policy response that can be sometimes hard to do.
It could be hard, I guess, to in the private sphere as well, right? To go in there and see, okay, these are the issues, or it's a bit more of a political hot potato.
Absolutely, yeah. And when it comes to police contacts, I think alternatives to early, young adolescents having exposure to the police should be considered when possible. Perhaps it's possible in some instances to have a social worker or somebody else intervene when the behavior is problematic rather than a police officer, which could be kind of more stigmatizing. That's not always possible. And in general, with research in deterrence, which you mentioned, sometimes it works, sometimes it backfires, it generally supports that there is a small group that tends to pose the biggest problem. So about, 6% of adolescents or 6% of individuals that become, repeat offenders and get drawn up in the system and commit most, the majority of all crime. And so for those, it's almost impossible to avoid police and criminal justice system contact. But there's another group that offend in adolescence, especially because that's when you see delinquency peak.
Yes.
But they are going to eventually likely, desist.
Desist if society can give them the right support, or so to say.
Exactly. Yeah. So I think there we want to avoid a harmful response by police and the criminal justice system that's focused, too much on deterrence and can otherwise be, stigmatizing. We want to avoid limiting their future so much because of the response that we have, or their perceptions of their own future, that they can become entrapped in criminal behavior, short-term mindsets, or these things that we want to avoid. And, when it is difficult or impossible to avoid these circumstances and we do see an increase in adolescent short-term mindsets, it's still possible to promote, building back a positive view of one's future and building back consideration of their future outcomes. And we do show, that these mindsets are malleable, ourselves and other researchers as well. For example, there's, cognitive behavior therapy programs that focus on reducing impulsive action and thought. envisioning one's future self. A colleague on this project, John Louis Van Gelder, he has found this to be linked to a reduction in delinquency, either just thinking about your future self or interacting with a version of your future self in a virtual reality environment.
Yeah, I think we had that back on the podcast, must be the last episode, I think, with the Future You project.
Future You, exactly. Yep, exactly.
Okay, it's not a case of giving up and saying, well, short-term mindset, always short-term mindset.
Of course.
But you can actually there are options to, as you say, work against this.
Yeah. So going back to the marshmallow test, we don't believe that these are innate differences that are set in stone at early childhood. Instead, I think we show that these things can be a response to a lot of environmental factors, a lot of social factors, and they can be changed since they're linked with bad outcomes. And there is even evidence that kids can be taught to wait longer in the marshmallow test and other delay of gratification tests. So I think, improving, thinking about the future prospects, these can help to mitigate some of the possible detrimental consequences of having short-term mindsets as a result of adverse environments and experiences.
Okay, wonderful, yeah. And that would then speak very much so against the model of the 3 strikes kind of approach then, because that's the absolute opposite then, right? We're talking about not supporting, we're saying it's a very harsh
a very
approach.
Harsh response. Yeah. And I think, especially in the U.S., we've seen mass incarceration rise as a result of having a very, harsh response to people's offending. And we see that those things have diminishing returns when it comes to actually decreasing the crime rates of society and thinking about people's lives as a whole and the healthy functioning of society as well.
So what one might think is a deterrent effect on paper is actually not at all. It's the absolute opposite then when those kind of approaches.
Yeah. I think, when you think about somebody with serving a very long mandatory minimum sentence and what that does to their view of the future, that can also play a role.
Okay, sure. Well, Jess, I'm afraid that's all we have time for today, but thank you so much for coming in, telling us about your findings and results. And
thanks for having me.
No worries. And I've got a pack of marshmallows here. I'm going to offer you one now or 2 later. What's it going to be?
I'm definitely going to take the one now. I don't know if I can trust you to give me the second one later.
I wouldn't trust me. All right, Jess, thanks so much for coming in.
All right, thank you.
Thank you for listening to today's program. If you would like to hear additional podcasts or learn more about our research, please visit our website at www.csl.mpg.de.